Good morning, everyone. We're so excited and delighted to have so many folks turn out for a day like this. One of our objectives with the creation of the Shalom Hartman Institute in North America, and I know that many of you have studied with us at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel, but since we created the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America about 5 years ago, our objective has been to, our very simple mission is to improve the quality of Jewish life through ideas. And our objective has been to create spaces like this and others. Many of you I know were there at Temple Emmanuel last night for sober yet exciting conversations about the central questions and challenges facing Jewish life, and to try to do so in a way that is timely to the actual unfolding of the challenges facing Jewish life. We realized essentially in the middle of the war this summer that these wars, and I wish I could say it in singular rather than plural, but these wars between Israel and Hamas have now occurred multiple times over the last few years and have destabilized communal conversation among Jews in North America. And these categories that we're using as the topic for our session today, loyalty, empathy, and moral clarity, appear regularly in Jewish communal discourse, oftentimes as blunt instruments against one another. Right? The portrayal or the depiction of being empathetic for the other is thought of sometimes as being an act of disloyalty. A fixation with moral clarity with respect to what are ultimately morally ambiguous conflicts in many cases is again used as an instrument to evaluate someone's loyalty. And while we understand or relate to all of these terms as part of what it means to be a Jew and be a human being, the existence of these various different terms is destabilizing a Jewish communal conversation. I know in the Los Angeles Jewish community that the public exchange of, call it letters or polemics, a couple of years ago between Rabbi Daniel Gordis, who was once of this community, and Rabbi Sharon Brous, which I just want to say parenthetically, I think part of the reason that took on the volume and weight that it did was because, if you recall, the Times of Israel was a new website, and it was driving traffic to the site. And the Times of Israel, therefore, turned what started off as seeming like a very toxic conversation between two Jewish leaders, wound up having 10 or 15 different articles, including by other members of this community, rabbinic and educational leadership, to participate and promote what felt like a very, in some ways, destructive conversation, even if in the context of that destructive conversation, it was surfacing a great deal of tensions right below the surface in Jewish communal life that were finally getting some airing. And if you recall, I don't know if you know this exchange of letters, many of you are shaking your heads that you do, the core question that was being played out, the core issue that Rabbi Gordis was trying to put on the table, is that loyalty to the Jewish people and the state of Israel, especially in a time of war, demands a strong articulation of loyalty, and any articulation of empathy, whether it's for civilians or for the other side, signals a failure of that type of loyalty. Or put differently, loyalty cannot almost not fully tolerate empathy and demands moral clarity. And the failure to actually enact that kind of moral clarity and to have some sort of empathy signals a failure of loyalty. Not surprisingly, this met with a great deal of resistance by many American Jews as well as Israeli Jews. And the point of that whole exercise, for me at least, was I think we learned a lot of lessons about civil discourse and how it can go bad. But B, what it surfaced for many of us following and listening to this conversation as it was playing out in the Jewish community was the urgent need to actually spend a little bit of time with these topics and in these places of conversation. That even if we have no unrealistic expectations of creating consensus in our communities, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, even if we don't have any unrealistic sensibility about creating consensus, it's critical that we locate ourselves inside this conversation rather than allowing it to overtake us. So that's the big topic that we wanted to play with for today. We've invited in a number of teachers and scholars and professors in the community to help us reflect on these questions from a variety of different disciplines. And our hope is very simple. When we do a project like this, process and outcome are identical. The very experience of getting together a group of Jewish leaders from across the community, whether you are professional Jews or lay Jews, folks working in the Hillel world, the rabbinate, sit on boards of Jewish organizations, students, whatever identity you bring to the table, This type of activity, sitting and learning, not as an extracurricular activity, but as a core activity of what it means to be a Jew, actually focusing our learning and our conversation on precisely the hardest questions, that act of showing up to do this should be a central feature of what it means to lead in the Jewish community. And from the perspective of what kind of outcome we're trying to create, we've already achieved it. So thank you, now you can go home. But honestly, our goal is to try to have a sober, honest, real conversation about some of the most polarizing emotional conversations in ways that enrich our discourse, improve the quality of our community, and enable us to see one another across a table and across a text as participants in a shared project. Our big topic today, as I said, is what does community look like with or without consensus? Some of you who were there last night when I talked a little about narratives of peoplehood at Temple Emmanuel heard me mention that this is increasingly the central challenge of the success story of American Judaism. We've created a community that has managed to penetrate so deeply and so entirely into the American fabric that has welcomed us and embraced us. If you're cynical or skeptical, you'll say to me, well, we've seen this story before. But as a fourth generation American Jew, I feel that we have to take seriously the possibility that what we are experiencing as diaspora Jews is in many ways unprecedented. And what a challenge that it's putting on the table is with an American Jewish community that feels confident and secure in its Jewishness in America, and a Jewish community in Israel that is confident and secure in its Jewishness over there. The reality that we see unfolding in front of us is that we are a community increasingly without consensus on virtually anything. Right? In many respects, the middle of the 20th century imagined an American Jewish community that, precisely because it was outsiders, needed to operate via communal consensus organizations. One of my favorite little pieces of data that I learned recently was that the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, which to its credit is one of the few major Jewish organizations that tells you exactly what it is in the title. The Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations was created by Eisenhower. People know that? It's amazing. It was created by Eisenhower because he wanted to talk to the Jews, but he didn't want to talk to all the Jews. So he said, send me one guy. Send me a Jew to talk to. And it's hard to imagine, but in the early 1950s, even though obviously there was dissent within the Jewish community, I don't mean to pretend that there was an orthodoxy that has been totally lost, but there was a relative ability for the community to talk with some sort of shared language or some sense of consensus. And that, I think it's fair to say, has widely deteriorated, which puts challenges on these convening organizations, but it also creates challenges for our community at large. And so the question I want to ask today in this opening session, and I hope you have the sources that went around, is about how does a community react or act? What are our options as a community when consensus seems to have been diminished? How do we construct community, or how do we think about community, especially in a moment of crisis? And I want to look at three different models, and I'll be kind of transparent that I like the third the best, but I want to honor the fact that the first two models of this community are authentic and serious from the perspective of Jewish history and Jewish literature, and they have to be taken seriously. But I want to offer three different models for how community operates when it's actually met with an external threat or an external challenge. I'd like to learn those together, and I'd like to reflect a little bit on how the wrestling with these different models can help us think about the present moment. The three models we're going to look at, one of them is called circling the wagons. I think you kind of know what that means. A second, we're going to use the language of heresy and orthodoxy. And the third, we'll call community of difference. And the question I want to ask is it possible for us to actually think about community and to constitute consensus even once we can no longer have consensus be an intrinsic or obvious category? I'd like to start off with a little bit of learning in Chavruta style, Beit Midrash style. I'd like to take this conference and use it as a context to do some learning together and to give you a context to see and interact with one another. So I'd like to start you off by asking you to take the first category, what I call circle the wagons. And I'd like you to study this short piece of text from Exodus 32, just to put it in context. Moses has gone up the mountain, and the people have remained at the bottom of the mountain. After Moses goes up the mountain, as you recall, the people take not very long before they begin to become skeptical whether Moses will return. And instead, via Aaron, they wind up actually creating a deity, dancing around it, and imagining that it's the golden calf rather than Moses who took them out of Egypt. And this is now the story of Moses coming down the mountain. And embedded in this story, and I want you to focus really on the verses in the middle of the story, which are verses, verses 25 to 28 is really where I want you to focus. You can read the first part and then spend a little time on verses 25 to 28. Moses does something dramatic and violent as a means of reestablishing order and norms of the community in the midst of this crisis. I'd like you to read that closely. I want you to try to get inside Moses' head. Why does Moses react and lash out the way he does? What is motivating this particular response and the need to reconstitute community in the way that he does? What critique might you offer of Moses' actions in this moment? But at the same time, what generously do you want to offer as the reasons why Moses has to do the way he does? I want you to spend a little time with that text, maybe 10 or 15 minutes together, and a couple of basic rules of chavruta. You can work in groups of 2, in 3, or if you want to meet as a whole table, you can do that as well. The objective is not just to have a deeper understanding of the text, but to really begin to put yourself into a conversation with these texts. So read the text aloud. English is fine. Read the text aloud. If you don't know what it says or if you don't know what to say, you can either read it aloud again or say whatever you want. And use the text as a prompt to begin this conversation on what theory of community is operating in how Moses reacts in this moment. We're going to take 10 or 15 minutes and then we'll regroup. There should be copies. Yeah, I'll get you. You need more copies? Are there more copies here? Yes. Okay, Moses is about to come down the mountain. He's holding the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, one written on one side and one on the other. The tablets are the work of God. Verse 17, Joshua says to Moses, he says, when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there's a sound like war in the camp. And we get a foreshadowing of about what is about to materialize, right? Moses gets the first warning that there's something afoot going on in this camp, which is actually challenging to the rest of the story because although we're inclined to believe when you get to Moses' reaction that it's a reaction of total surprise and anger, here you get a hint that he actually knows that something is afoot before he even sees the camp of Israel. Right? So it goes to the heart of his emotional state, or to the extent that he's reacting emotionally or rationally, you have some hint that he knows that he's about to see something that he won't like, that's augmented by the fact that Joshua says it's a war, and he says, that ain't no sound of war. Right? In war, you might hear the people losing or winning, it sounds like a party, and that feels to him completely strange and bizarre. And it came to pass, verse 19, as he came near the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets from his hand and broke them beneath the ground, right? Beneath the mount. Moses reacts by throwing down the tablets, and again, it's not clear of whether Moses is doing this out of purely anger and rage, meaning has he lost control in this moment, and therefore he throws them down because he's furious, or has he destroyed the tablets as a form of punishment? Both of those could be a response of anger, but one is anger of loss of control. He throws them down because how could he just kind of loses it. And the other is, I'm bringing you down a gift and I've decided to now destroy it because I don't want to give it to you anymore. Yeah, Michael?
I think we have to see the whole thing with the idea that Moses has just been up and is coming down.
Mm-hmm.
That is the introduction to the section is Vayera Moshe.
Right.
Now come down. The transition between where he's been and the community has not been with him. People of Israel has not been with him. It's a dramatic transition.
Good.
He can't tolerate the fact that he doesn't understand, he can't tolerate the gap between his experience and their experience.
Good. So he not only is descending physically, he's also descending emotionally, and he's experiencing the gap between the kind of erotic, removed relationship that he's had with God on the top of the mountain, where it's just been him and God in this embrace, and now his re-entry back to planet Earth actually indicates that things have gone awry in his absence. It still prompts the question of whether he reacts emotionally in this moment or he reacts pragmatically. When he does these series of punishments that come next, is it a form of lashing out, or is it a form of punishment towards those who he thinks have acted inappropriately? And then he does something even more violent. First he destroys the tablets, and then he does this incredibly violent act of taking the calf which they had made, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder. I get that, right? You destroy the icon that they're worshiping, and scattered it among the people and made the people drink of it. It's actually brutal, right? There's something brutal and torturous about not only, you've committed this obscenity, and now I'm going to make you eat this obscenity. Right? It has a certain vile quality to it. The other thing, though, is in some ways you kind of get to the end of that and you say, okay, well, now the story's over, right? He's punished them. He's force-fed to them the stuff of their own transgression. He's made them actually eat it. Isn't the story now over? He talks to Aaron. Aaron indicates to them what had actually happened. And then you get to verse 25, which is the turning point of the text. Yes?
I hadn't thought about this before, but they just left the land recently.
Yes.
Moses just became their leader very recently. Why did they follow Moses' advice at this point? Why did they just tell Moses to stick it? Why did they allow themselves to go through this?
So a great question is, why do they actually turn to Aaron in this moment? And I think from a kind of rational human perspective, they are a leaderless people, and they're just looking for whoever's going to stand up in front of them. If you want to be a generous reader of the Israelites, there's good reason to believe that they feel that they are now actually leaderless. Moses went up to a mountain where God has just had thunder and lightning on that mountain. And remember, if you touch the mountain, you die. Moses goes up the mountain and disappears. Totally reasonable for them to think they are now leaderless. And so who do you turn to? The leader's brother. The guy who was standing next to him when he kept doing that stuff with the staff. Right? There's something natural and predictable about the quest here for human leadership to be led in this moment. And Aaron is kind of a pathetic character here of, look, they wanted it and so I provided it for them. But the turning point comes here in verse 25. Moses saw that the people were naked. This word naked here, I think, means not literally naked, but naked in the sense of either vulnerable or in some ways depraved. He sees something about the people which signals that whatever I've forced them to do has not fully taught them a lesson, and that they are standing somewhat pathetically in front of him. And upon seeing them in this condition, Moses stands, for Aaron had made them naked to their shame among their enemies. Moses stands in the gate of the camp and says, Mila Hashem Elai, who is on the Lord's side, let him come to me. And all the Levites gathered themselves towards him. And he said to them, thus said the Lord God of Israel, put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And the Levites did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. There's a lot of problems in these couple of verses. Number one, Moses says, thus said the Lord God. Where? It's bizarre, right? Moses has now says to and why do you suppose he does it? Why does Moses actually invent that this is what God has told him to do in this moment?
It serves his leadership.
So it serves his leadership, right? It reinforces his own authority. Anyone else?
He speaks for God. He's reading the tablets as a spokesman for God.
So maybe the generous reading of Moses is he is actually God's agent, and therefore he's allowed to speak for God. The most generous, right, the most generous and apologetic reading would say he's now kind of got constant walkie-talkie time with God, and that God had indicated to him that this was going to happen. That would be an apologetic reading of the text. But the more likely reading, or at least the one I like better, is the political reading, which is, if he's about to do this act of violence among the people, he can't do it simply on the basis of his own authority. And so the authority that he has to channel is, this is what God wants us to do in this moment. Because it seems like a profoundly violent, divisive act among the people. In order to be able to do that, you have to be able to channel God's leadership rather than decide it on yourself. Others? Yeah, Josh.
He could have said God's law dictates that I
as you'll see later on in the text, God affirms the choice, right? Because God perpetually wants to wipe out the people who don't obey, and Moses keeps putting his life on the line for the people. But God affirms the choice of weed out those who have done bad things. But you're right, it does seem that he is kind of covering his own tracks by saying this is what God wants of me rather than the people. Yes?
But it provides a moral justification. So
Good.
that in the aftermath of what is about to occur, was God demanding this time.
Correct. So it has a political element to it, an authority element. Right. Good. It's political, authoritative, and moral. Right? It's not, I haven't decided to do this act of violence. God directed us to do this act of violence in order to preserve, ultimately, the intactness of God's dignity here. Right? Because this is mostly an embarrassment to God. Moses takes it very personally. But look, I'm about to give you the tablets of the law, and in the meantime, you're worshiping the golden calf. And therefore, to make it about the reassertion of God's morality in this moment, makes it a very clean black-white that people can't continue to be constituted on the basis of this transgression. Yes, one last comment.
I was struck by the number of the small number of people killed.
Yeah, isn't it strange?
That's less than 1% of the total number of people, and then it's telling the Levites to go out and kill their brothers, their neighbors. And I always had a sense that it was at least a large majority, a large minority of the people who were involved. If that were the case, it's small. Where's the rest of the people? That makes sense.
Yeah, shouldn't there be like 595,000 dead people at this point? If there are 600,000 people leaving Egypt, and Moses has said, right, and here the theory of leadership that's embedded in this moment, and I'll come back to your comment in a second. The theory of leadership that's being played out here, or the theory of community, is on this circle the wagons approach of I will stand here, I will establish this as being the place of morality. If you come towards me, you get to participate in communal life. If you stand out there, you are by definition suspect. This is why I give you as modern midrash George Bush's 2001 speech 9 days after 9/11, in which he famously says, right, in the wake of the trauma of 9/11, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. Right? He divides the world into a category of two. There's those who will stand with us in this moment, and everyone else. There's no such thing. Like usually when you think about horrendous moral circumstances in the world, there are actually three categories of individuals. There are perpetrators, there are victims, and there are bystanders. Right? That's the way that we tend to think of the moral division, right? In this moment, Bush's reaction is there are either perpetrators or there are victims. Either you stand with us in this moment, or there's no kind of neutrality in this moment. You don't get to occupy a place of neutrality. Moses is kind of the architect of that ideology in this moment. If you're standing over there, if you're unwilling to stand near me, you become vulnerable not just to the accusation of being other, but you become subject to our sword. And so it's only those who are willing to come nearby in order to perpetrate this. And yet you get this weird problem of why are only 3,000 people dead? Any thoughts? Yeah.
I have rejected the tripartite division, perpetrators, bystanders. There are rescuers, there are neighbors, there are collaborators, there are people who have provided, there are upstanders, there are people who shade in between. We have much evidence for
Yeah.
people who shade for a while, then ran out of energy spent for commitment. We have evidence of people like Gospel Shulman who were perpetrators for a long time and then finally got transformed.
But even so, even if you make the picture more complex, that it's not merely a distinction between perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, this moment in Moshe's leadership reduces the distinction between an us and a them. You are either standing with God in this moment, or you are standing against us. And if you're standing against us, you are subject to the violence that we're going to actually perpetrate in the name of God and in the name of our side. So any theories as to why it's only 3,000 people?
Because it really wasn't 2 million.
So maybe it wasn't that many people to begin with, so therefore 3,000 was a high percentage of the population. I don't know. I kind of feel like either you take the math of the Torah as it is and then work within it, or you don't. But, you know. Any other thoughts? Why only 3,000 people?
Not many places.
I'm sorry?
Enough to make an example, but that would be enough, and everybody else will follow.
Okay, so maybe it's a symbolic act of violence, which is significant enough to then make, in other words, the minute you start the actual massacre, at that moment, it's only a few people who run towards Moses. But as the massacre begins, more people have begun to gravitate towards Moses. It's only the people who remain on the outside who are ultimately killed by this. Yes?
Don't we define that as terror?
Huh?
Don't we define that as terror?
Don't we? Well, we'll have to ask that question. Yes? Go
How
ahead.
many Levites are there? Maybe they could kill more than, how many numbers are there?
So
Well,
maybe,
is
right.
this military?
So maybe we're only really interested in killing those of a certain class of people who are unwilling to identify with us in this moment. And if that's the case, it's a particular class of leaders. So Moses is not really carrying out this act of violence against all of the people. He's only differentiating between which Jewish leaders in this moment are willing to stand with him and which of them are standing against him. And therefore, even though this continues to be a very violent act of constructing community, it's a much more strategic violent act of constructing community, which is I'll kill off those among the people who are still leading the people in the direction I don't like. Yeah, Dara.
That still presumes, though, that it's very clear who is bad enough to be killed and who is on the border and who then are the innocent bystanders. You know, as if to say, go out and get the following types of people, and they had a list within those 3 seconds, versus go out and do your best to assume in the moment you will know who to kill, which is a very messy way of
Well, right, except that here there's not a list. Here the list is created by simply the act of expressing loyalty. What's so simple and clean from the perspective of the massacrers, the perpetrators of the massacre, is that I don't have to evaluate the legitimacy of your loyalty to the people. It's not on me to figure it out. If you fail to stand up in this moment and express your loyalty to Moses, you are by definition outside of the pale. In other words, in order to have this theory of community and leadership, you have to have kind of rapid-fire loyalty oaths in particular moments. And you hear, I mean, it's hard to overstate this. You hear this happening today, right, in both the American Jewish community and the state of Israel, where loyalty is not a complex issue to be negotiated. Let me figure it out. But if a person fails to simply be loyal in a particular moment, that signals a failure of the moral clarity that loyalty demands, and that makes you vulnerable to all sorts of things that I might then do to you. And then I can say, it's not me who did it to you, it was your failure to stand up in this moment. Right? When someone is attacked for empathy for the Palestinian people, what's being suggested there is that that in and of itself is an insufficient act of being loyal to the people. Just right now, all I want from you is express that you stand with Israel. And if you can't simply do that act, then you are essentially on the other side of the story. Yes?
It's also very hierarchical. I noticed that it says, you know the people. They are set on evil. And the whole idea is that there's leaders who know, and then there's people who know nothing and are bent towards evil. And that's the thing that I noticed, is how
Good.
hierarchical.
Good. This model of community also assumes an elitist mode of leadership. The community's identity is shaped by the attitudes and behaviors of a particular set of leaders. And if I want to set the community back straight, all I need to do is wipe out a few leaders who are standing in opposition to me, and I've been able to reestablish as a totalitarian regime this leadership of the community in this moment. One last comment? Yeah.
What really always disturbs me about this piece is that every man shall slay his neighbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
It isn't that we bring them in, forget a court, that we just even bring them into one central place and the authorities will do it. But you are urged to go out and kill your brother or your neighbor who now you are empowered to make that decision about who hasn't stepped up quickly enough to be loyal. And I find that to be the most frightening part of it.
Correct, but precisely the point is, a court of law requires a nuanced and complex understanding of guilt and innocence. In this model, it's did you stand up when your people demanded it? And if you failed to stand up when your people demanded it, you have by definition become the judge and jury of your own fate. And I, as the executioner, am merely carrying out a fate that has been already existed for you. Does anybody want to read generously on behalf of Moses here? Why is Moses acting this way? What is motivating Moses in this moment? Yes?
What I was kind of building on what this woman just said. What troubles me about this is that the people who stood by Moses, and I don't think that this is a generous interpretation, were his family members. So the Levite tribe went out and decided who were the enemies of the people. The family of Moses, in effect, did that. So it seems to me that it's a very narrow interpretation of what is loyalty, because it's not loyalty to the tribe. It's the whole tribe of Israel. It's loyalty to Moses' tribe.
Great. This is tribalism literally and figuratively, right? Which is the tribalism of the only people who come nearby are those who are on his side, and that winds up dividing between the tribe that is his tribe versus the larger tribe, the way it's used colloquially today, which is the Jewish people. Yes, were you going to give you a generous reading for Moses?
Yeah, he could be like a political leader who sees the loss of leadership. He comes down from the hill, there's loss of leadership in front of him. So he says, what can I do? Like maybe call an election and try to change things. And instead he kills a bunch of people.
So maybe, right, there is a moment of a vulnerability of leadership here. And what happens when a leader feels themselves boxed into a corner, feeling this experience of vulnerability? It's almost not surprising that you have to reassert leadership with essentially a violent act to compensate for this feeling of vulnerability. Anyone else? Yeah.
Maybe he's looking at this as kind of an existential moment. This could be the end of what everything
Correct.
he believed in and what he thought these people should be following.
Good.
So he's looking at this in the extreme example of if I don't straighten this out, this could be the end of this. This is existential.
Great. The existential threat. If I pause in this moment and try to do a big symposium of trying to figure out what loyalty means in the moment during a time of war, I will probably lose the war. Or at least I will be distracted and I won't be able to motivate the people where I need to be. What's one of the things that's happening in this text, which I want to say editorially as part of the challenge in the Jewish community, is an insufficient acknowledgement of Moses' fear in this moment. What's about to deteriorate and fall apart? This standing underneath the mountain at Mount Sinai, and it turns out that this whole exercise of trying to achieve a freedom and a destiny for this people is made vulnerable by the fact that the whole social order has deteriorated. And so when I perceive a social order having deteriorated, when I feel an existential threat either on the outside or the inside, it's not surprising that Moses does this kind of violent act of reasserting the centrality of his own leadership and making very clear that there are moments in time when either you are with us or you are against us. And this is, because of that anxiety and fear, a moment for establishing that kind of hierarchy. I want to move on to the second model, and I'll take other questions against it.
Very apropos because it seems to me what we're grappling with now.
We absolutely are. And part of the question we're going to have to ask at the end is, when do you establish that you're living in which moments? When do you actually say, this is what we're in and this is what we're not in? I want to look at the second model. Well, we're going to do one of the texts that's here, and you're welcome to take this. We have nicer versions of the packets that came from the printer, and you could take them with you and study the rest afterwards. Look at source number 3 for Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1. If the first model of the construct of community is circle the wagons, right? And what that means is, I stand here, and I demand loyalty. And if you are unwilling to pay me that loyalty, you are necessarily on the outside. Community becomes the willingness to establish loyalty without caveats. If you come along and say, right, I am loyal to you, but here are the conditions of my loyalty, I'm sorry, you're about to get massacred by the Levites, right? That's an act of disloyalty. A second, more attenuated version of this is not simply express loyalty and then you get to belong. A second form of this is, here are the rules of belonging. Right? It's more generous to the people on the outside because it gives them parameters, guidelines, if you will, of what it means to be loyal, but it still winds up creating a distinction between us and them. This is the world that I call heresy and orthodoxy. Right? Here, if you violate these norms, you are a heretic. I'm not saying it's the distinction just between us and them, but us and them can still be created by virtue of the fact that you obey or disobey these general guidelines of what you're allowed to think or say. The classic heresy-making text in our tradition comes from the Mishnah Sanhedrin, which later Maimonides will turn into law. And just for fun, raise your hand the minute that you no longer get a share in the world to come. The Mishnah starts off and says, The Mishnah starts off and says, all Israel has a portion in the world to come. In other words, in theory, everybody belongs as part of the community and consensus. Except, for it is written, your people are all righteous, they'll inherit the land forever. But the following have no portion in the world to come. One who says that resurrection is not a doctrine from the Torah. One who says that the Torah is not from heaven. And an apikoros, that is one who denigrates, in this interpretation, one who denigrates Torah and Torah scholars, but it's probably one who actually is on the inside of being understanding Greek philosophy. In other words, you start being part of the center, but if there are things that you say or do, it takes you out of being part of that consensus. So consensus is not simply created by a loyalty oath. Consensus is created by your willingness to start as part of the people and then to not cross certain boundaries. Rabbi Akiva adds, one who reads from heretical or outside books, that pretty much knocks out anyone in the room. One who whispers a charm over the womb, and then Abba Shaul finishes, one who pronounces the four-letter divine name as it is spelled. Now the text gets a little weird here, right? What are these things talking about? The only useful thing about this text for our purposes is that this is, when you get this little piece at the end of the text, it suggests it's actually a live button. Meaning, as this idea that you can create boundaries of entry or exit, as it exists within the tradition, over time people will add on different characteristics or behavior depending on the time period in which they're living. Oh, these people are doing that weird thing? Yeah, include them on the list. It sounds like idolatry, it sounds like marginal behavior. This is a constant and chronic activity in Jewish life, is the making of heresies. Now, again, we could take a generous reading which says, every community has boundaries, right? Every family has boundaries. The minute that people start acting in a certain way, what they're indicating to you is, I don't want to be part of your community anymore because I'm not willing to play by the rules. And whether it's the rules of law, or whether it's, in this case, the rules of ideas, there are always, every community out there, we don't have to feel embarrassed by having rules of belonging and behavior. Every community out there has things that you're not allowed to do and that keep you as part of it. The question I want to ask today, right, is in the current context of loyalty, empathy, and moral clarity, how is this model of community being played out in some of our institutions? Right? Where do you see this approach to community and leadership, this heresy? You're fundamentally in unless you say or believe or do these things. Anyone want to reflect on this? Examples that you see? I'll give you a hint. Where are we? Hillel is actually publicly playing out this question in conversation. Right? Hillel is playing this out very publicly, that any Jewish student is welcome in the Hillel building anywhere around the country, except, right? Thank you, Chaim. Except, right? They will not put on stage or host events by speakers who violate certain heretical ideas with respect to the state of Israel. Now, this is different, again, than Model 1. The first model is all you have to do is express loyalty to the Jewish people. This is a model of heresy. You're basically all welcome, except if you actually cross these boundaries and thresholds. So again, I'm curious for other examples, generous readings or critical readings of this approach to community and consensus. Thoughts on this? Yes?
The big exception is if you deny the right of the state of Israel to exist. So I think that's where the door finally closes at the boundary of numerous conversation with us or not. And that's a pretty firm boundary for the Jewish community if you're going to stand up and say, even though the Torah Karta may go a different direction and they're still in the crew because they've got all these.
So it can be blurred. You can reduce the heresy-orthodoxy divide in such a way that you're basically calling it a loyalty oath. But what I think someone would generously say in response is, no, I'm not trying to create a distinction between an us and the them. I'm trying to establish the legitimacy of basic ideas and norms that define my community. And if you're not willing to actually abide by those norms, you're implicitly saying, I don't want to be part of your community anyway. that these are core values to us, and therefore the transgression of those core values means that you've decided not to participate in this community. Other thoughts? Yes?
I think, at least in educational institutions, you can have different programs coming from different approaches, and each program is defining what heresy is. And oftentimes exactly the opposite of. And so you can have, I think that's when we can see it played out. When there's not one overall definition in an institution, this is heresy, then the Moses paradigm is defining heresy one way, the individual engagement is defining it in a different way. And that's part of the problem with discourse right now, is that everybody's defining what is okay individually instead of as a whole.
So are you suggesting that the problem is not this very activity of doing this, which is a normal activity for people to do, but that there's no central infrastructure to actually establish the heresy for the community? So the fact that one institution decides that heresy lives over here doesn't allow for the possibility that someone else comes up with a different definition of heresy.
No, I'm suggesting that without communication between those groups, they become islands that are each creating their own heresy, whereas a group like this allows for an expansion of the understanding. Not that we want to centralize one necessarily, but just the kind of strategic isolation that a lot of groups have, that creates a different kind of problem.
Okay, good. Other reactions to this? Yes?
What you were saying, I think, was very interesting. What is the definition of heresy? And so I think that this model tolerates dissent. But the question is, how far does it tolerate dissent? So I would suspect that there are many of us in this group who would find certain things as heresy that would be much narrower than an orthodox definition of heresy.
Good. So there's two possibilities here. One is you say, I basically agree that a community should be allowed to determine heresy. I just disagree with where they've put the boundaries. A second, right? And that's a classic Jewish activity, right? I don't disagree that you're not allowed to say this person's Jewish and this person is not, because everybody winds up ultimately having some definition of membership and non-membership, right? You can't walk into any institution and say, I demand membership simply by showing up. Right? Maybe there's things you have to do, things you have to believe, features of your own ethnicity or whatever that entitle you to membership, but I disagree on where you're sticking the stakes in the ground. But there's a very different critique which comes along and says, Jews should not be in the heresy-making business. Right? Let's just allow a kind of community to radically flower in whatever directions it wants to be, right? And then, so what that there can be essentially no such thing as heresy, that our community has evolved in such a way that heresy is not possible. And I would suggest that in the contemporary debate, especially around Hillel and other Jewish institutions around this heresy model, that's under the surface. There's some who simply disagree technically with where the community has established the boundaries, and others who disagree with the whole activity of boundary making. So let's look at this third model, which is the anti-boundary making activity, and then we'll have final questions and comments. If you look just at the text number 8 on page 8. You don't have page 8. There's a second packet of sources in the middle of the table. Everybody got it? Okay, everybody got page 8, source 8? Song of Songs, Rava 2:5? Yes?
Now, it's on page 8 in the second section. Yeah, there's a second piece of paper, and the front of that piece of paper says it's on the basis
Yes?
of their understanding.
Everybody got it in front of you? Okay, so I want to look at this text which imagines a different scenario of what it means to constitute community and constitute consensus, and also in its own internal narrative is born out of a moment of crisis. And the crisis here is particularly the crisis of the Bar Kokhba rebellion 60 years after the destruction of the temple, when there's an external enemy, which is the Roman Empire, and there are internal tensions in the Jewish people about what it means to stand up to that Roman Empire. So it has a good resonance to the types of crisis questions we're navigating today. Rabbis say as follows. At the end of the persecution, our teachers gathered at Usha, and these are they: Rabbi Judah, Rabbi Nehemiah, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Jacob. Now, before we go on, if you were going to use the heresy model to think about how community gets constituted by this set of individuals, what would the text say next? What's that?
Thus said the Lord.
Either, right, that's right, thus said the Lord, right? That's actually a little bit more of model 1. What you would imagine that the text would say next is, they then set out the rules. This is now, we are a community that's experienced crisis. If you behave this way or that way, these are the rules of belief that you need to have in order to remain part of the community that we're constituting. That's what you would imagine the heresy model would dictate in a moment like this. The text actually says something different. They sent to the elders of the Galilee saying, whoever has learned, let him come and teach. Whoever has not learned, let him come and learn. They gathered and learned and took care of all of their needs. So what's the community consensus models that's being imagined by this text? So number 1, study. Right? How does a community establish its norms? It has to pursue some sort of educative intellectual process as the core activity. Right? That's number 1. Other things that you saw here. Yes?
There's something to be dialogical. I'm not sure that's the exact word.
Good.
People going to exchange views. I learned it this way or I see it that way.
Okay, good. So it's not just study in the neutral sense, but there's a clear exchange of ideas, which I would go one step further, starts with hierarchical exchange of ideas. There are people who are teachers, and there are people who are learners, and you accumulate communal knowledge on the basis of that exchange between those who are teachers and those who are learners.
And
Yes?
then you will create a community of likeness.
Correct, and then you'll create a community, you say of likeness, but I'm not sure that that's there. You will create a community through that process of teaching and learning. See, one of the things that drops off in the end of this text is you start with a group of people who are teachers, and you start with a group of people who are self-identified as non-teachers. But then the last sentence doesn't say they gathered, they taught and learned, but rather they gathered and learned. Rather, the whole act of creating community through teachers and learners is that actually everybody becomes a learner. So when you start with the teaching and learning, you need some hierarchy to kick off this process, but the hierarchy ultimately diminishes and gives way to a collaborative process. Other things that you see going on here.
Like the following phrase that says, they took care of all their needs, all the issues that people have through a process of learning, were more or less resolved and mitigated.
Right.
That's what I get out of that.
So this just doesn't become, you could imagine that this would be an interesting text to think about how does the intellectual fabric of a community gets constituted, but you get this last piece stuck in that says they actually took care of the community. That actually building that intellectual collaborative process of teaching and learning winds up positioning them to be able to take care of all of the needs of their community. Right? Now, maybe it's their own needs, but this winds up being a kind of ripple effect outwards of the reconstituting of Jewish leadership is actually an educative intellectual process. Yes?
It also establishes teachers as leaders.
It establishes teachers as leaders with the caveat that they also become learners.
Right, and you can't teach without learning.
Right.
You can't learn without teaching.
That's right. But
You can't
right.
lead without teaching.
If this was a heresy text, teachers are leaders, but they are leaders because they establish rules. In this model, teachers are leaders because they constitute the community and create a space for the community to become constituted. And then by the end of the text, you see they kind of get out of the way.
I also noticed it says all of their needs. That is interesting because when you think about teaching or learning as sort of an intellectual process and it doesn't take care of the other, like it only takes care of certain things. The text clearly says here all of their needs.
That's right.
To say it's all, it sort of covers everything.
And that's why I like to think of this text as a useful model for thinking about what constituting community actually consists of. That once you've established that this is what community is, that community, like any other community, can actually take care of itself. Yes?
Are all these rabbis of the same opinion? Are we looking at it? I don't know.
I don't know either.
So we don't know where they come from, because it's easy to all come from from one school.
Right. If you want to box this into a heresy orthodoxy text, then you say, well, you rigged the game by starting with 6 guys who agree with each other.
Right.
But part of what you would expect if they all agreed with each other is that what they would then do is write the books and get everybody to subscribe and be loyal to those books. But instead what they do is they actually open the doors. They say, now that we've established this is what the community is, anyone who wants to participate should participate. The model of consensus and community that's being imagined by this text is that community and consensus are created by those who show up. If you show up, you get to participate in the communal life of the institution. You get to work on the side of creating consensus. If you don't show up, then you're on the outside, but simply on the virtues of your own choice. You can't stand outside the process of creating community and consensus and then complain that you're not included if the community actually creates the space for you to show up and participate in this discourse. One more comment, yes?
It all depends, I guess, who are the teachers, who makes the decisions. Because nowadays, where many groups of leaders who makes decisions, who belongs to this community and who doesn't. So, you make a decision how to convert Jews to Judaism. Who makes the decision what is a kosher conversion and what is not?
Good. So let's ask the final question that I want to ask is, let's say this is a different model of community and consensus than either kill your opposition or create heresy lists of who can't be included. Let's say you took this model and said community actually consists of those who are willing to show up and participate. Is this public policyable? Can a community actually live and survive this way? You ask a question such as, how does a community like that establish boundaries? Right? Because you have to decide at a certain point that there are rights of entry or rights of passage to come in. Is this theoretically applicable, even if we like this model, even if it's appealing, even if it's kind of what we're trying to model today, of come and teach, come and learn, and then you wind up constituting community on the basis of ideas? Is this a model that's actually workable for Jewish communal or institutional life? Any thoughts on that? Yes?
Isn't it yes, because there's Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist Judaism, and the others? Isn't that an example of what we're talking about?
Maybe. So maybe one example somebody says is denominationalism is as a reflection of this. I'm not sure. That seems to me like a lot of boundary making. If you want to be a Reformed Jew, here are the rules that make you different from a different Jew. So I'm asking, what would a radical version of this kind of community look like and whether it's implementable? And you can say no. Like Yehuda, this is an interesting idea intellectually, but it's not a way for a community to actually function. Any thoughts on that? Yes?
I think this absolutely does work, but just as we asked before, where is your outside boundary question, and is the survival of the state, or the right of Israel to exist? The outside boundary question here becomes the definition of, can you be a Jew for Jesus, or where is the moment you have crossed out of the Judaism line? But other than that, hopefully this is one where your teachers become students and your students become teachers. That's why we have a room like this today. It's not just a room of rabbis, and it's not just a room of synagogue presidents, and it's not just a room of communal leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to hear and learn from each other. But there's always an outer edge of the boundary that says, I love that you think Jesus is fabulous. This would
Doesn't get you in. Good. So you still want to hold on to some sense of the need of an outside boundary. And for you then, it's not sufficient to say, if you're outside of that boundary, the act of your participating doesn't make you part of the whole. You still need to do some work of heresy to establish inside and outside. Yes?
I don't think it works.
You don't think it works?
It's
Okay.
anarchy. To me, it's anarchy. It works in a small group context, but a larger group, there has to be someone or some group that establishes some rules that you should play. And I think those of us who belong to temples, who are Jew and clergy, should set the tone or boundaries of our particular institution that may be different than others.
Good. So a different argument, and instead of, you argue actually there needs to be some boundaries or limits of what the community is, and you argue that there needs to be some hierarchy within that system, otherwise you create anarchy. Let me suggest a third possibility. What if you say, this is a way to constitute community, but it doesn't mean that everybody gets to be right? right? So everybody gets to participate in the conversation, but you can still establish policy. But once I've established policy, it doesn't mean, therefore, that someone who doesn't agree with that policy is outside the community. It just means that sometimes you don't get your way. Would that be a modification of this that enables it to survive? There was a comment in the back. Okay, go ahead right here. I'll take the last one.
The big thing is, how do you get to that policy? And how in this community, actually, this is feminism. This is how we function. Everybody has a voice, but we have ways of prioritizing so we ultimately can make that decision so the needs are met and people feel like they've been part of making the decision, even though it may be different than what they might have chosen, but they were part of it.
Good. So maybe part of it is getting in this goes in this direction, similar to what I said. You enable everybody to actually participate in the communal discourse, and you still wind up creating processes by which you can establish policy, but the policy doesn't become a blunt instrument to actually exclude people from the process. You create the possibility of being part of the process and yet wrong. Right? And that's not the same as establishing a heretical line between being inside or outside, nor is it the same as massacring those with whom you dissent. But it is obviously, and I'll close with this, it produces much more anxiety. A model like this of community, on one hand, is much more radically embracing of dissenting and diverse opinions, but its cost is anxiety. There's no anxiety with Model 1. You killed off all the people who are dissenters. You've identified really quickly who's in and who's out. There's actually also less anxiety in Model 2 because you've been very transparent about the boundaries that you've named of insiders and outsiders. In number 3, you don't use ideas as the means of establishing boundaries. You create a process by which everyone can participate. And as a result, you do surface the anxieties of leadership and you surface the anxiety of boundaries very differently because you've made possible all ideas to be heard. But I'm not sure it has to end with not establishing public policy. As the last takeaway, I'll say, and then I'm going to give you a break and we'll go to our next sessions. Take a look when you have a chance at Lincoln's second inaugural. The remarkable thing about Lincoln's second inaugural is that in the middle of a civil war, right, literally in the middle of a civil war, when the country is polarized in two, you would expect a Moses reaction, right? What Lincoln models in this discourse, which I think could be a great takeaway for a moment of leadership, is he actually gives this speech in which he says both sides are worshiping the same God. Neither is 100% right, and it's possible that some of us are wrong, but we ultimately establish policy to fight this war, and we're going to pursue it. In other words, he's fighting a war without demonizing the other. And it's actually a remarkable moment that suggests the possibility, that I want to just leave today as a suggestion, suggests the possibility of leadership that actually has a direction, and that it has a public policy, but does so without trying to work very hard at constructing a boundary between those who are in and those who are out. Thank you. Go take a break, and we'll resume in 10 minutes.